Hey all, how's it going? Okay, I've been meaning to do this for a while. We're going to talk about phase. Not the most exciting subject, but an incredibly important subject for your tracks. It can make or break your drum sound. So maybe you've noticed that sometimes you have an incredible kick drum sound in the room, and you come in and you're like, where's the low end? I put the mics in the right place, but nothing's happening. Or you seem to have set your overhead mics up in stereo and they just don't sound right. So there's a few aspects to this. So let's just dive right in. The first thing to do, especially when we're talking about stereo microphones on your kit, namely probably overheads or room mics, is to measure them from the center of the snare. And we do this so that the sound lands at each mic at the same exact time. So phase can be two things. It can be timing, and it can also be polarity. So without getting too technical, because this is the way I understand it and it seems to work, I listen for things. So you'll often see engineers measuring microphones. So what you want to do is measure from the center of the snare. Take a tape measure or a cable and measure, put it in the center of the snare, measure the microphone on the hi-hat side. Make sure, at whatever distance that is, you want to measure the other microphone at the exact same length from that. So you'll notice sometimes that microphones are like this. They are different levels. They are not at the same level. This is because for the sound from the snare to reach the level of these at the same time, because they are farther apart, they need to be at different heights. Okay, I'm sure that makes sense. Also, if you're in a Glenn Johns type sound, if there's a mono overhead, you're measuring from the center of the snare and the mic over by the floor tom, you're measuring that to be the exact same distance. So the sound lands there at the same time, and we're not having a timing difference. Okay, and you also in a Glenn Johns, you would measure the kick drum mic to be the same. That way everything's perfectly in phase. And last but not least, you want to measure your room mics to make sure that the sound, typically from the center of the snare, is landing there at the same time. Technically, I guess you could measure from the top of the bass drum to make sure these mics are at the same spot. But, you know, I always learned just from engineers doing it from the center of the snare. Okay, so that's step one. Basically, you usually don't have to do anything. If you measure these correctly, then your overheads, rooms, or Glenn Johns setup are in phase and you're all good. Okay, but of course, we have other microphones on the kit. Okay, so for instance, let's say you have two bass drum microphones or a top and bottom snare. You need to make sure those are in phase. And also then, of course, you need to make sure that all the microphones, overheads, snares, kick drums, mono overhead, rooms, whatever you got, are all in phase with each other. So this is where the real kind of tricky part comes in, because one thing may be canceling out another thing without even realizing it. And sometimes there's an occasion where something's out of phase where it actually sounds better or it really works in the mix. So you often hear a cool guitar tone on a record which sounds maybe small or sounds a bit off, and that's because they're purposely flipped out of phase because it kind of makes a cool thing. Often in drums though, it's just ruining it. So I'm going to show you my process of checking phase after I measure. Okay, so once you've measured your microphones, you can check phase in two ways. One, of course, is just by zooming in on the audio. So let's take our overheads here. Let's put them in jumbo so we can really see here. And then we're going to zoom in, and of course we can see that we're in phase. Things are landing at the same time. And then our polarity is correct because we have positive going up here and we have negative going down at the same time. If we go to our room mics, which are here, you're not hearing them anyway, but we can see that positive is going up and negative is going down at the same time. This is exactly what we want. The timing of these, okay, it looks like these are unmeasured perfectly, but they do sound fine. Okay, so I often use my ears more than I look at things. Okay, so this is my process of checking phase. I'll look at something, I'll listen. Let's go to the two kick drums here. So, of course, I can see with the kick out and the kick in that the polarity is the same. We got positive and negative here. But what I do is I almost never zoom in like this. When I come in from playing for like 30 seconds to check phase, I have usually my Pro Tools tracks in the kind of medium setting here, and I just listen. So I'll solo kick out, and then I will solo kick in together. That's all I want to hear. And then what I do is, in Pro Tools there's something called a trim plugin, but in the plugins I use often, these Slate plugins, I use the trim. I'm going to get rid of these just so there's no confusion. This trim plugin right here, and I just hit the phase flip right here. Alright, so I'll flip the inside kick so we'll hear the difference. So we can hear the low end come in and disappear. I'll do it one more time. Okay, oh, these are not even at the same volume level. So let's hear one more quick extreme example here. Okay, so we can hear how the kick drum is nice and full when they're in phase. You flip them out of phase, there goes your low end. And this is the big thing, where if you have a great drum sound, this is what I mean by where's the low end. It could be that something's out of phase. It happens with snare too. So this is the next thing I do. I check my kick drums first, make sure those are in phase. Then I check snare top and snare bottom. And I just flip one of them. Okay, so that's pretty subtle, but there is some low end in the snare when it's in phase. And when it's out of phase, it's disappearing. It's pretty subtle, so sometimes it's hard to hear, but that to me is pretty obvious. So at that point, I know my kick and snares, the individual mics are in phase, so we're good. Next, I'll add overheads. And then I will go up here and I will flip the phase to make sure that... Let me rewind a little bit. So, if something is out of phase, I then know I will go to my mic pre and I will flip it there. And I will make sure that the plugin is flipped back to normal here. Okay? Okay, so I always want to be recording the source in phase. I never have plugins where... one's up and one's down. I just want them all in phase. And of course, if somehow I screw something up, later on, I'll just flip the phase on the track and then print it. But I never just go in and just leave my things like this one's in phase, this one's out of phase, this one's in phase on my plugins. I guess you totally could do it that way, but it's not my style. Okay, so here we go. Overheads. Turn the overheads on. Let's check the phase with the overheads. Okay, again, pretty subtle, but what I hear is the low end and the snare disappearing when I flip the overheads out of phase. So that's how I know. Okay, then once, so I know my overheads and kicks and snares are in phase. That's the most important thing usually. Okay, you want fat kick and snare, obviously. Then I'll add rooms. Sometimes I'll go to the overheads and check them with the rooms. Okay, actually, right there, it sounds better if I flip them out of phase. So I messed up. So if I was going to bounce this track to someone, I would keep this plugin flipped, and I would make sure to print it that way. Okay, I try to avoid any error like that, but now we know. Okay, but now let's check this out. I'm going to put the kicks and snares back in with the rooms and overheads and just double check, because sometimes maybe the rooms are out of phase for a reason, because they sound better with the kick and snare. Okay. Okay, so there's the answer. If you notice, the kick drum, there's a little more woof on it when the rooms are out of phase with that. I guess we could, at this point, go move microphones and get them all aligned, but to me, the room sounds fine like this. It's adding the ambience that I need, being out of phase, and actually having it technically out of phase. It's bigger, so I'm totally cool with that. So hopefully you can follow that. Some things flipped out of phase are good. Okay, so now we know overheads, kicks, and snares. Let's check this mono mic. Okay, let's check the phase on this. Okay, again, that sounds better to me when I flip it out of phase. Let's turn the room on and check. Yep, totally. It sounds better out of phase there. So I would go to the mic pre and now flip the mono mic, which would have been channel 14 here. I would have flipped it on the mic pre and moved this back to being basically off. So is what it says here. Okay, next let's check rack and floor. More low end in the floor tom when it's in phase. Let's check the rack real quick here. Sometimes I'll mute the floor tom doing this, so we're only hearing that tom. Okay, it's really subtle, but it sounds better in phase, so we're good on the toms. Hi-hat, I rarely ever find that that's messing with the phase, but it could be a thing where it could knock your snare or something out of phase. So check that, but rarely ever do I find that there's an issue with phasing in my hi-hats. Okay, so we see here, oh, there's also a sub kick. Let's check this. These three kicks together. Okay, that's pretty crazy. It's dropping the whole fundamental much lower when I flip the phase on the sub kick. So let's zoom in here and see what's happening. Right here. Okay, it's all in phase. So that could be an interesting thing. If you flip this and okay, that could be a useful thing. You flip that sub out of phase and you get like a lower fundamental. Personally, I think in this track I wanted the punch, and that kind of low mid punch, like 150, 200 or something, seems to be disappearing when that sub is out of phase, and we're losing that. But I wanted that in this track. I wanted that thing, but again, that could be an interesting sound where you flip phase and then you get this kind of lower fundamental, and that maybe help the track. All right. So in conclusion, you don't have to be an expert in electricity or polarity or anything like that with this. It's really, to me, it's about using your ears. Of course, in DAWs now you can go manually and look at things. Use your visual sense to go in and check things. I'm sure there's a lot of people that just really go in and look at things as opposed to listening to it. I like to use my ears. I like to flip things around. But the most important thing to me is when I send tracks to people, I want to know that everything is in phase. There's a well-known mixer that one of my tracks went to a handful of years ago, and he sent me an email, and it was actually very nice. But he said, "Hey, I just want you to know the kick in and the kick out that you sent me were out of phase." So he wasn't bagging on me; he was just letting me know. But of course, that was a nice kick in the ass to say, okay, nothing's ever going to leave my studio again that's out of phase that someone has to kind of worry about. So it's an important thing for your sounds. It's an important thing, I mean, I don't want to say your reputation's based on it. That's silly. But, if people have to mess with phase once they get your tracks, that's kind of a pain in the butt for them. If a mixer has to do that, or somebody trying to track to your stems is kind of wondering why they don't sound as good to you as you thought, because things are out of phase and they have to go through and flip things. That's problematic. So this is a thing that you got to mess with, like every time you set up, every time you move a microphone, every time you change a snare or a kick drum. This is almost like a daily thing that I do, is check phase. So I run in there, I play, I come in, I listen, I check the trims, I go back to my mic pre's, I flip it there, and I make sure everything's right. So don't let things leave your studio out of phase. Don't let it kill your awesome sounds from your awesome drums that you're getting. And get to know it. It's not too hard. Use your ears.